At 4:22 p.m. on a Thursday in late October, I was sitting in a boardroom on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Calgary, watching a man I'd known for exactly 6 weeks put my salary on a projector screen in front of 23 people. I remember the exact time because I'd been watching the clock. I had a call scheduled with my biggest client at 4:30, a guy named Gordon Firth who ran a mid-sized construction supply company out of Red Deer, and I was mentally calculating whether I could wrap up this quarterly alignment session in time to step out and take it. I never made that call, but not for the reason I expected. My name is Daniel Carruthers. For 11 years, I was a senior account director at Meridian Industrial Partners, a B2B sales consulting firm based in Calgary that specialized in placing long-term contracts between manufacturers and distributors across Western Canada. I was 44 years old. I had a mortgage on a house in Altadore, 2 kids in high school, and I was, by every measurable standard, the person most responsible for keeping the lights on at that company. I want to be careful here, because I'm not someone who leads with his own accomplishments. My dad was a pipe fitter for Medicine Hat, and he raised me to believe that the work speaks for itself. But what happened that Thursday afternoon made it necessary for me to say out loud what I'd spent 11 years letting the numbers say quietly. I managed approximately $34 million in annual contract revenue. My client retention rate over a decade was 91%. The firm's total revenue when I joined was just under $19 million. When I left, it was $52 million. I am not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because the man standing at the projector didn't know any of it. Or maybe he did know it and it didn't matter to him. I still haven't decided which one is worse. His name was Trevor Aldgate. He'd come in from a management consultancy in Toronto, one of those firms that charges $600 an hour to tell you things your own people already know. And he'd been brought in by the board as the new president and CEO after our previous CEO. A woman named Pauline Deschamps, who had built the company from scratch, retired in August. Pauline had given me 2 weeks' notice before the announcement went public. She'd called me personally, which I appreciated. She said the board wanted fresh strategic direction and that she hoped I'd give Trevor a fair chance. I tried. I genuinely did. For the first 5 weeks, I answered every question he asked, walked him through every major account, explained the history behind relationships that had taken years to build. I showed him why Gordon Firth at Red Deer Construction Supply had stayed with us through 2 recessions. I explained why the Hennessy Group in Lethbridge renewed every 2 years without us even having to pitch. I told him about the time we'd eaten $80,000 in fees on a botched logistics contract just to keep the relationship intact with a client who now represented $4.2 million in annual revenue. Trevor listened to all of it and said, "That's an interesting model. We're going to need to think about scalability." I should have known then. The October meeting was framed as a leadership alignment session. All the senior directors were there, plus Trevor's 2 people he brought from Toronto. A young woman named Cassandra who handled strategic initiatives, and a man named Phil who was apparently a data analyst, though I never once saw him produce any data that reflected how the business actually worked. Trevor started the meeting the way he always did, with a slide that said, "Optimizing for sustainable growth," and a graph that showed our revenue curve flattening slightly over the past 18 months. What he didn't show, what he never showed, was that the flattening was entirely explained by a deliberate strategic choice Pauline had made to consolidate our client base rather than chase volume. We were making more margin on fewer, better contracts. It was working. Then he moved to the next slide. It was titled Compensation Structure Review. And there, in a table in the middle of the screen, were the names and total compensation figures for every senior director in the room. My number was at the top, $318,000 base plus performance bonus, which had brought my total package to $374,000 the previous year. I felt the room shift. I'm not someone who reads body language particularly well. My wife has told me this many times, but even I felt it. The woman from HR, whose name was Brenda Lapointe, was suddenly very interested in the notepad in front of her. The 2 directors sitting to my left both looked at the table. Trevor said, "What you're seeing here is a compensation structure that's developed organically over time without a consistent framework. When we benchmark against industry standards across the sector, we find some significant outliers." He clicked to the next slide. A bar chart. My bar was the tallest, and it had a red line across it labeled Market Median. The gap between my bar and the red line had a label too. 67% above benchmark. He said it as though he was reading a weather forecast. No preamble, no context, no conversation with me beforehand. Just 23 people in a room and my compensation displayed like a problem to be solved. I said, "Trevor, what benchmark are you using?" He said, "Industry standard data from our compensation analysis." I said, "Which industry?" Because B2B industrial sales consulting in Western Canada is not the same market as general account management in Ontario. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that means the other person has already decided you're being difficult. He said, "Daniel, I understand this is uncomfortable. The point isn't to single anyone out. The point is to build a structure that's sustainable." I said, "My total compensation represents 1.1% of the revenue I directly manage. Can you show me where that's out of alignment with anything?" Cassandra typed something. Phil looked at his laptop. Brenda Lapointe turned a page in her notepad and kept writing. Trevor said, "Revenue attribution in a relationship-based model is complicated. We can't assume the revenue follows the individual." And that was the sentence. That was the one. Because if there's one thing 11 years had taught me, it was that in this business, in this specific, relationship-driven, long-term contract business, the revenue absolutely follows the individual. That's not ego. That's just how it works. Gordon Firth didn't renew his contract with Meridian Industrial Partners. He renewed it with me. The Hennessy Group didn't call our main line when they had a problem. They called my cell phone. I took a breath. I said, "Have you spoken to any of our clients about this restructuring?" He said that client relationships were a company asset, not an individual one, and that the transition would be managed appropriately. I said, "Trevor, I turned down an offer from a firm in Edmonton 6 months ago because I believed in what we were building here. I'd like you to understand what you're proposing before we go any further." He said, "I think we all appreciate your tenure, Daniel." Tenure. Like I was a professor being put out to pasture. I sat with it for about 30 seconds. I looked at the slide still on the screen with my name and my number on it. I thought about my dad, who spent 30 years showing up every single day to a job that never once acknowledged what he was worth, and who retired with a bad back and a handshake. I thought about Gordon Firth, who had texted me 2 weeks earlier to say his son was getting married and he wanted me and my wife to come. Then I thought about the call I'd had in April with a firm called Pinnacle Western Group, a growing industrial partnerships consultancy out of Edmonton. Their managing director, a straightforward woman named Sandra Kowalczyk, had offered me a senior partner role with equity participation and a base of $340,000. I'd turned it down because I wasn't ready to leave Calgary and because I still trusted what Pauline had built. Sandra had said when I declined, "The door is open, Daniel. Call me when anything changes." I looked at Trevor. I said, "I need to make a call." He thought I meant a bathroom break. He said, "Of course, we'll take 5. I walked out of the boardroom, took the elevator down to the lobby, stood next to the big windows that faced 9th Avenue, and called Sandra Kowalczyk. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Sandra, it's Daniel Carruthers. Is that position still available?" There was a pause. Then she said, "I was wondering when you'd call." "Yes, it is." I said, "I'd like to take it." She said, "When can you start?" I said, "I'll have my resignation letter to you by end of day." I went back upstairs. The meeting was still going. Trevor was talking about role redefinition. I walked back to my seat, picked up my leather portfolio, the one my wife had given me when I got promoted to senior director, and said, "Trevor, I'm gonna need to step out." He said, "Daniel, we're still in the middle of," I said. "I know." "We're still in the middle of," I said. "I know. I've accepted another offer. HR will have my formal notice this afternoon." I thanked the people in the room who deserved to be thanked. I shook Brenda Lapointe's hand because she'd always been decent to me. I did not shake Trevor's hand. Then I walked out. I want to be honest about the next few days because I think people expect these stories to have a clean, emotional arc where the protagonist feels righteous and certain from the moment they stand up. That wasn't my experience. That night, I sat in my kitchen with my wife, Catherine, and she asked me to walk her through it again. Slowly, from the beginning. She's a pharmacist, practical, measured, not prone to drama, And when I finished, she said, "Did you confirm with Sandra that the offer is real and the terms are the same as April?" I said I had, but she made me put it on speaker and call Sandra back right then, that same evening, so we could both hear it. Sandra confirmed everything, sent the offer letter by email within the hour, and Catherine read through all 4 pages at the kitchen table before she said, "Okay, you did the right thing." I told my kids that weekend. My son, who was 17, asked what would happen to my benefits. My daughter, who was 15, asked if we'd have to move. I told them no to both. Alberta health benefits would be covered under Pinnacle's plan, and we were staying in Calgary. What happened next, I did not plan and did not orchestrate. I want to say that clearly, because some people, when they heard the story later, assumed I'd been working some angle. I wasn't. I just showed up to my new job and did the work. But here is what happened. Within the first 2 weeks of my departure from Meridian, I received calls from 6 clients. Not because I called them, I was careful about that, because I'd gotten legal advice about my non-solicitation clause, which applied to direct outreach but not to receiving inbound calls. They called me. Gordon Firth called me from Red Deer on a Monday morning and said, "I heard you left. I need you to know that my renewal is up in March, and I'll be going wherever you are." The Hennessy Group called 3 days later. A client in Saskatoon I'd worked with for 7 years called the week after that. By the end of November, 11 clients had made contact with me. By mid-December, 7 had formally notified Meridian that they would not be renewing. I found out through Brenda LaPointe, who texted me privately in December, she was job hunting by then, that Trevor told the board the client departures were a temporary retention issue that would stabilize in Q1. He brought in 2 new account managers from Toronto to replace me. Neither of them had any background in Western Canadian industrial markets. The board gave him until February. By February, the revenue impact was not temporary and it was not stabilizing. I heard later, through people I'd worked with for years, that Meridian had lost somewhere between 28 and 35% of its contracted annual revenue. I don't know the exact number and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that by March, Trevor Aldgate was no longer with the company, that Meridian had begun a restructuring process that included layoffs, and that the board had reached out quietly to Pauline Deschamps to ask if she'd consider returning in an advisory capacity. Pauline, from what I understand, declined. I don't take satisfaction in the layoffs. Those were real people, some of whom I'd worked alongside for a decade, who lost their jobs because a board made a bad decision and then compounded it by hiring someone who didn't understand what he was walking into. If I feel anything about that part of the story, it's a kind of low, steady grief that it had to happen at all. What I do think about sometimes is the specific logic that Trevor used in that boardroom. The idea that compensation should be benchmarked against a generalized market median rather than against the actual value being generated. The idea that relationships are a company asset that can be transferred cleanly when the person who built them is removed. These aren't fringe ideas. They're the standard framework of a certain kind of management consulting that treats businesses like spreadsheets and people like line items. It doesn't work. It especially doesn't work in industries where the entire value proposition is trust built over time between specific human beings. You can't benchmark that. You can't transfer it. You can't transfer it right out of existence, which is what happened. I've been at Pinnacle Western Group for just over a year now. I'm a senior partner. I have equity in the firm. Gordon Firth renewed his contract and brought in a referral from a colleague in Grande Prairie that added another $1.8 million to our book. The Hennessy Group signed a 3-year agreement in January. Sandra Kowalczyk asked me recently what I'd tell someone in a similar situation. Someone sitting in a meeting watching their value get misrepresented on a screen in front of their peers. I thought about it for a while and I said, make sure you know what your options are before the meeting happens. Not because you should be looking for the exit. You shouldn't. Not unless the exit becomes necessary. But because the moment you have no options is the moment someone else controls the whole conversation. And know the difference between a company that values you and a company that values what you produce while resenting what you cost. Those are not the same thing. I confused them for longer than I should have. The day I handed in my notice at Meridian, I drove home on Crowchild Trail with the windows cracked even though it was October and cold, and I passed the Bow River where it runs along the west edge of the city. And I remember thinking that the river looks the same whether you're having the best day of your life or the worst. It just moves. That's not a profound thought, but it helped. My offer letter from Pinnacle is framed and hanging in my home office, next to a photo from the Industry Awards dinner last spring where I received the Western Canada Industrial Sales Leadership Award. My daughter picked out the frame. She said the gold one looked too try-hard and made me get the simple black one. She was right. She usually is. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that followed. The client departures, the revenue collapse, Trevor's exit, and I don't think it was karma in any mystical sense. I think it was just consequences, moving at the speed that consequences tend to move when someone makes a decision based on a spreadsheet instead of reality. Trevor wasn't a bad person. I want to say that honestly, even now. He was a person who had been trained to see businesses as systems of inputs and outputs, and who had never been asked to seriously reckon with the fact that some of the most important inputs don't show up in a compensation benchmark report. He walked into Meridian with a framework that had probably worked somewhere else, in some other context, and he applied it without asking whether it fit. That's not evil, it's just a specific kind of intellectual carelessness that happens when confidence outruns curiosity. What it cost him, and more importantly, what it cost the people at Meridian who had nothing to do with the decision, was entirely predictable. That's the part that still sits with me. It wasn't unpredictable. Anyone who'd spent real time in relationship-driven sales could have told him what would happen. Some of the people in that boardroom probably knew. But there's a particular dynamic that takes over in rooms like that, where someone arrives with authority and a polished slide deck and a vocabulary borrowed from business school. And the people who actually know things go quiet because they've learned that being right is not always the same as being heard. I think about what it took for me to say out loud, in front of 23 people, "Have you spoken to any of our clients about this restructuring?" That wasn't a brave question. It was an obvious one, but asking it required me to decide in that moment that I wasn't going to stay quiet to keep the peace. That decision, that small, specific choice to say the thing I actually thought instead of the thing that would smooth the situation over, is the one I'm most glad I made. Not the resignation, not the call to Sandra, that question, because it meant that whatever happened next, I hadn't pretended. There's something I've come to believe about the way a working life either holds together or doesn't, and it has to do with whether the way you behave matches what you actually know to be true. Not in a grand philosophical sense, just practically. I knew what my client relationships were worth. I knew what Gordon Firth's renewal represented. I knew that the number on Trevor's slide was accurate and meaningless at the same time. I had a choice about whether to act on what I knew or to sit quietly and accept a version of reality that was convenient for someone else. The 11 years I spent at Meridian were worth something precisely because I'd spent them doing the work the right way. Not cutting corners on client commitments, not overselling what we could deliver, not taking credit for team outcomes I didn't earn. That's what built the relationships that eventually walked out the door with me. You can't manufacture that kind of trust quickly, and you can't retain it through restructuring memos. It accumulates slowly through small choices made consistently over a long time, and it follows the person who made them. Catherine still has the email Sandra sent that night with the offer letter attached. She printed it and put it in a folder. She said she wanted a paper record of the moment things turned around. I told her things had turned around the minute I walked out of the boardroom. She said, no. They turned around the 11 years before that. She was right. She usually is.